23 Word arrives in black. I woke up early the next morning, still in my clothes from the day before. As was my habit, I slung my rifle onto my back before leaving the tent. Before I could stop myself, I crept over to Rose's tent, unzipped the doorway not more than an inch, and peeked inside. She was alone, curled in her fetal sleeping position on her bedroll. I sighed. Thank God. I tiptoed out of the camp, not wanting to run into anyone yet and have to answer to the "Where were you last night?" or "Why'd you storm away?" questions. Hey, French, over here. Halfway up the incline of the westward-facing hill, Clarence held his hand up above his head to get my attention. He was with Meg in general and a few other men I didn't recognize. They were all wearing shades of green and brown, and two of them had leafy branches stuck through their hats. I waved and made my way over. You got your gun on ya? Clarence shook my hand and nodded at the gun barrel over my shoulder. I nodded. All right then, let's go, hunting day. Meg clapped me on the back and smiled, happy to see me there so early. I didn't want to tell him it had been a fluke, that I'd fallen asleep in fits and spurts and gotten up when I couldn't force my wandering mind to stay stationary anymore. I spent the day in complete silence, trying to emulate the grace of the older men through the woods. Out there was water. You could smell it in the air. The more north we got, the more life was left in the woods. I inhaled big. Closer you get to the coast, Clarence whispered, pointing east, west, then north. The more water is left that can be drunk. The middle grounds? He made his hand stiff and made a striking motion. Nothing. It's like where the bomb landed and the poisons leached into the banks. Everything's gone in all directions so you get further out. I didn't know what to say. I knew that it had been Clarence's traditional territory. Sorry, was all I could manage. If he heard me, he didn't let on. All we need is the safety to return to our homelands. Then we can start the process of healing. I was confused. How can you return home when it's gone? Can't you just heal out here? Meg and General gave each other knowing looks, and Clarence was patient in his answer. I mean, we can start healing the land. We have the knowledge, kept through the first round of these blasted schools, from before that, when these visitors first made their way over here like angry children throwing tantrums. When we heal our land, we are healed also. And then he added, we'll get there. Maybe not soon, but eventually. A high whistle came through the trees, and General pulled me to the ground with him. I was frantic. Was it the recruiters? I tried to claw my gun strap to pull the weapon into my hands and onto the ready. On the other side of me, Meg turned around and put a finger to his lips, shushing my small noises. I heard footsteps, a deep echo in the ground, and then branches breaking. Finally, there was silence, and then another whistle, this one shorter. From around me came the sudden sounds of breath, and I realized we'd all been holding ours. Then movement as everyone scrambled to their feet. Was it the recruiters? I asked out loud. Did they get anyone? General answered, No, little brother. That was the scouts letting us know they had an animal in sight. One that was the right age to be taken. Sounds like they got it too. I coaxed my heart back into normal rhythm and followed to the group where they had, indeed, taken down a good-sized buck. Meg was preparing the ceremony when I got there to send it off in a good way. We allowed the deer to take his dreams with him, so he had all the magic he would need to find the next world. We returned mid-afternoon as heroes. I was more than a little smug, tromping down the hill, helping to maneuver the weight of a full-grown buck on the travois we'd strapped together out of branches and snoo. Even though I'd done nothing but tag along and then panic when the kill was actually made. Still, I was there. I was damn near giddy when I saw the look on Derek's face as we passed by where he was leg wrestling with his friends. He had his shirt off and tucked into his back pocket. I couldn't help but notice the definition of his muscles. I flexed under my sweater. Uncle, I told you to wake me up, he whined, jogging alongside us to speak. I shouldn't have to wake you up. You should be awake and ready like the rest of the men, like French here. I tipped an imaginary hat in his direction and watched the color blossom in his cheeks. He stopped following us, and we made our way to the outdoor kitchen near the mouth of the cave. Oh, French, that's a beautiful buck. It was Rose. She ran over from the clothes washing area and put her hand on my arm. It made me shiver, and I had to try real hard to remember why I was angry with her. But once I had that image of her and Derek, the dink, two-stepping right in front of me, I pulled away from her. Yeah, why don't you go watch Derek wrestle over there? I pointed with my lips. I'm sure he'd love to have a cheerleader. Her face fell, and I started feeling flustered. What are you doing, Frances? She said it low, since there were others around. Why don't you just call me French? Only the people I respect can call me Frances. I couldn't stop myself. I wasn't even sure how much of this I meant. She grabbed me by my elbow and led me through the kitchen around the perimeter of the hill, back towards our camp. When we reached the first tent, I shook loose and she turned on me. What in the hell is your problem? She was only 6 inches from my face, and I could see anger flash in her dark eyes. What do you mean, what's my problem? I'm not the one who's mooning over some jerk with a drum. It was louder than I'd meant it to be, and she flinched. You're the jerk around here. You wouldn't even talk to me yesterday, and you expect me just to follow you around or something? She pursed her lip together when she was done, like she had just struggled to keep back some words. Oh, I'm sorry I can't be at your beck and call all the time. I wasn't sure why I'd said it. It's not like she actually expected that. I'd even screwed up my face and flounced my hands about, as if imitating her snobby behavior. Well, this managed to unpursue her lips. You know what, French? You're different. At first I thought it was because of Riri and Minerva, but no, you're even more different here. Her voice broke on the names a bit, but she took a breath and kept going. I should just leave. After we find Minerva, I should just go. I don't want to stay around here when you're being such an ass. I'd regret this next line forever. What? And leave your new boyfriend Derek behind? Whatever. Don't expect me to chase after you. Her eyes filled with tears, and I was ashamed. So ashamed I dropped my head and looked to the ground, and all I saw of her retreat was the movement of her shoes as she took off, sobbing. I waited until I couldn't hear her, until I was able to move my heavy limbs and drooping head. I couldn't go to my tent. I was scared to be alone in there right now. So I trudged the path back to the cave, past the celebrations in the outdoor kitchen, up the corridor into my father's room. I flopped face first on his bed and stayed that way until he came in an hour or so later. He rustled about for a few minutes, and then, satisfied that I was awake, began to speak. Did I ever tell you about how I ended up in the city? I shook my head. I couldn't remember even hearing stories about my dad outside of him being my dad. I hadn't really considered him anything other than that. I ran away. I should have sat up, showed some interest, but I just couldn't. I heard his calloused palm rub at his mustache, an old habit. The sound made me feel safe and very young. Yep, I was 13 when I decided. That young? Uh-huh. I remember that day too. It had rained in the morning, but the sun came out after lunch. I tilted my head towards his voice so that he held my face in the palm of one hand, listening. Painted wood. When you leave it alone, works itself out, like it needs to get back to an honest shade. It'll fade blue to skinny green. The church where I went that day, it had rubbed itself gray. It made the birch around it seem real stark by comparison, like bone splinters sticking out of the ground like that. He settled his weight on the bedside beside me and continued. I remember the old people used to say that the church was a medicine house. I sat there that day on top of my backpack in the aisle between two rows of pews, so rough they'd cut your legs if you wore shorts to service, and thought, this doesn't look like no medicine house to me. They used to say that men who came in left as something entirely different, something with hands that wouldn't obey natural laws and hearts heavy and empty at the same time. Me? I needed something to change. Maybe that's why I went over there to that church. Nothing seemed solid to me anymore, like everything was a drawing of what it was supposed to be, you know? I felt my hands would pass right through the door when I showed up, but that day my hands needed to touch something real. He extended his arthritic fingers out in front of him, throwing shadows over the bedspread. The church sat in the woods behind our rec center. It was like a small comma in a long sentence. It was shallow and narrow, not much bigger than the portable where Mrs. Gunther taught English with Reader's Digest magazines. When it was used, it held about 20 people or so. That's at best. 15 of the Boyer boys were at service. Me? I didn't give a shit about God or the Jesus one way or the other. But I knew this would be the last place they'd look. If my mare decided to get up that day, and if she knew me anymore, she might come. I didn't care. She'd be better off talking to the woodbugs outside. She'd get a better response. They wouldn't think of new swears to yell at her or jab her with the stick sharpened by Grandpa's old hunting knife. But then, I might not either. You could never tell by then. I could never guarantee anything. His voice sounded far away. I turned so that I was facing him now. He spoke to a soft spot over my head and nearer to the wall, like this was a story that was written in the space between us. The rages came at the weirdest of times then. Eating Cheerios, watching music videos, hanging out. A garbage can got set on fire outside the school. I couldn't even tell you for sure if it was me. He kind of laughed there, a laugh with no joy in it. Then I thought, geez, what if it isn't my mom that finds me here? The thought made the back of my knees prickle. What if it was one of them in a pickup truck, on a dirt bike, in a shiny government black car, one hand outstretched, the other hidden behind a back? His body went rigid. I read the stress in his veins that popped anxious braille into his neck. His eyes looked at something I couldn't see. And what was there even to keep me safe? What, a broken crucifix maybe? My pocket knife? I was 13 then, not old enough to fight a grown man. So I did the only thing that came to mind then, something I'd done only once or twice before when shit got real bad. I got to my knees, pressed my fingers so tight the skin around my bitten nails ached, and I prayed. I needed an answer. I prayed and prayed, closing my eyes so tight I saw constellations on my eyelids, and I listened for an answer. I listened and I heard a bird. I heard a cricket, and I heard some kids yelling for someone to pass the ball. And then, there it was, the answer. The smooth swish of metal and rubber on the Trans-Canada, tied like a ribbon of tar over the bush. Old Highway 11. So I nodded my thanks to the blind Christ and threw my backpack over one shoulder. I was scared, but more scared of staying. I knew at least on the other side there could be a place, any place, where hands couldn't reach. We were quiet for a minute. He was so still it frightened me. Then he pulled away from wherever he had gone and smiled at me. I went to the city after that, bummed around for a bit, tried to stay away from the cops and the military when they took over. I found your mom there. She was the most beautiful girl in the world, and I mean as dirt when she wanted to be, but not me, but not to me. He smiled real big then, and there was joy in that. I was so happy French. She made me feel like I was important, like a captain of industry or a scientific genius, and then it was just from the look she'd give me when I was doing nothing special at all. It was amazing, really. Now that's medicine. Don't need no damn house to keep it in. He nodded his head, as if convincing me of the truth of it. Then from out of the cave came a shuffle of feet down the corridor and voices getting louder in the valley. Jean, asked him. It was Clarence shouting for my dad. We both stood, and I helped him out, up and out. I slung my rifle forward as we made our way down the hall and into the valley. Chi-Boy popped out of the shadows as he'd been waiting there all along on a spring. They're on the move. Tomorrow. It was an old man in black robes, waving his arms while he shouted, half out of breath. The sound of air being punched out of a gut came from Mig. He'd come from the kitchen to stand behind me. Priest, he managed. I raised the rifle so he was in my sight. Chi-Boy rushed towards the man, lowering his shoulder in tackle position. French, wait! Chi-Boy! It was my dad, yelling with his hand up towards us. Chi-Boy stopped charging midway. This is Father Carroll. He's our guy on the inside. I lowered the gun and turned instead to brace Mig, who was bent over with his hands on his knees, pale with the shock of seeing a school official. Carroll has news about Minerva. The older man sighed his relief and tried again. They're moving her tomorrow morning. They'll be taking her to the airstrip just west of here to fly her into the capital. My heart sank. The capital? How'd we get there on time? Well, I guess that's it then. I kicked a rock that skidded to a stop just in front of the priest. No, son. Dad was smiling. That's great news. I squinted at him. How do you figure? It was Father Carroll, confident he wasn't about to be mowed down by a bunch of angry Indians, who answered, Because, my dear boy, they must pass right by here on the Trans-Canada to get from Espanola to the airstrip. They'll be bringing her right to us.